Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn Blog. And I'm going to do a bit of hard truths with normie sociology. And that means I'm going to cover the work of Musa al-Gharbi, the writer of We Have Never Been Woke, whose Substack I've found fascinating in its directness and often accuracy. So let's get into it. Smart people are especially prone, or I would actually say essentially prone to tribalism, dogmatism, and virtue signaling. There's a lot of reasons for that, right? And you might go virtue signaling. I've talked about vice signaling and other things, and yeah, there's a lot of that too. Dogmatism, yeah, that's also true. And tribalism, yeah. There's a reason why the cognitively complicated often are selected for ideological consistency. There's a reason why they are often used as the ideological bulwark of a regime or religion. I mean, this is not new. It's one of the things that makes us interesting, and I will include myself here. I consider myself a symbolic rentier, not a symbolic capitalist, but nonetheless, this is minor difference. Symbolic capitalist, people who work in fields like education, particularly higher education, consulting, finance, science and technology, arts and entertainment, media, law, human resources, and so on, tend to have an unusual political preferences and dispositions compared to most other Americans. They're weird in the basic sociological sense. These idiosyncratic ways of talking and thinking about morality and politics have come to dominate symbolic capitalist preferred political party, the Democratic Party, leading to increased alienation from the party among normie voters. And this has been true for a long time. Now, it's only really become true post the Atari Democrats and Clinton. It started all the way back in the 60s, actually around the time that William Buckley was complaining about it. But it really didn't become dominant until the end of the shift from the Atari Democrats to the DLC, and really accelerated towards the end of the Carter administration. These long-running trends, which date back to the late 60s and accelerated during the Clinton years, were exacerbated as a result of the post-2010 Great Awakening. Symbolic capitalists consolidated themselves more intensely into the Democratic Party, even as our own views grew more extreme relative to the rest of the public. Now, I have no problem with having extreme views relative to the rest of the public. I don't think it's a virtue to be mediocre. But, and I say this with all the advisement that comes with it, there's a danger to becoming radically disconnected from large groups of people who have expertise and knowledge you don't have. And that's still true for the great majority of the population. During this period, the Democratic Party's messaging and priorities radically shifted to reflect our desires in ways that left the party increasingly out of step with the median voter. And it became increasingly dominated by NGO talking points, which often borrows the language of morality from far leftists, but also uses it to build up things that are almost a para-government. This generated electoral backlash amongst the population that are sociologically distant from us. And it's been no clearer than in 2024, from my perspective, where the average voter under 50K voted for Republicans for the first time that I've ever noted in modern history. Such as ethnic and religious minorities, less affluent voters, less educated voters, and so on. These trends were reflected in every single midterm and general election after 2008 and culminated most recently with Donald Trump retaking the White House following the 2024 elections. And the midterms are gonna favor the highly educated because they're more likely to vote. My book, We Have Never Been Woke, shows that the transformations the Democratic Party underwent during this period were not unique. After 2010, many other institutions, especially those connected to the symbolic economy, grew more overtly moralistic and political. I actually have my theories for why this happened beyond just, cognitive complications. It became more morally and politically homogeneous in ways that put them out of step with most other Americans. However, they also grew more disdainful and intolerant towards public opinion on these matters instead of prioritizing preference and priorities of symbolic capitalists who comprise their most valued employees, clientele, investors, and audiences, aka their real base. This has contributed to a growing mistrust in our institutions amongst large swaths of the public, creating an opening for right-aligned political entrepreneurs to win support by running against us. There's often a mistake that the negative partisanship actually started on the right. And yeah, the right has always been negatively partisan. That's part of what being conservative and or reactionary means. But there's a way in which this whole America shit that started in the aughts, and people think they're cute for spelling America with a K and shortening it like Murika, as if that's funny. Our original is not a form of negative partisanship, and it's one that is self-flattering, and that is always dangerous. And voting to render institutions of knowledge and cultural production accountable and responsive to the people, once more, as the book also shows, the contemporary backlash against the post-2010 awakening isn't unique either. This phenomenon that recurs in each previous periods of contestation within and about symbolic professions, too. This is what Peter Churchill was talking about the middle tier collapse, although I don't think it's collapse coming, at least not the way he thinks, not apocalyptic. At present, the most empirical indicators seem to suggest that the current Great Awakening has run its course. Symbolic capitalist and aligned institutions are moderating, even though they might not yet have returned to the ascendant baseline. Critically, even in normal times, the symbolic professions tend to be morally and politically unusual and parochial. We're more likely to be Puritans, frankly. Moreover, independent of the awakening, they have growing increasingly unrepresentative of the public in many respects over the last half century, with important consequences for the functioning and legitimacy of these institutions and the quality of their knowledge and cultural outputs. We Have Never Been Woke explains why the awakening play out the ways that they do and why they occur when they occur and so on. This essay is designed to explore why symbolic professions are so unusual, even in ordinary times. But to get a leverage on the question, we have to start by clarifying a few important points about how human beings tend to perceive and think about the world. Our cognitive and perceptual systems are fundamentally geared towards self-advancement and coalitional struggles. Enlightenment era scholars, and many classical scholars before them, believed that human cognition was oriented towards truth, objectivity, and logic. Deviations from this idea were held to be caused by forces external to our minds, such as physical appetite, social corruptions, and malevolent supernatural entities, which is, ideology par excellence, in my opinion. But striving to liberate ourselves from these external influences, one could approach the idea of pure reason and perceive reality in its true form. Almost no liberal believes that today. The contemporary scientific consensus has coalesced around a completely different understanding of human rationality and perception. For instance, contrary to our earlier conceptions of cognition, juxtaposing the body and the mind, it's now understood that we always think with and through our physical bodies, and there isn't a way around it. Buddhists had that reality a long time ago. The five aggregates, the bodies, most of them. All right, anyway. However, thinking is not something that occurs exclusively within our individual corporeal forms. It often occurs primarily in conjunction with others, in dialogue with our physical and social surroundings, and with the use of human-produced tools and resources alongside other cultural artifacts. At a fundamental level, we think with and through other people in our environments in much the same way we think with and through our physical bodies. Who you pick as friends, people, really fucking matters. That's why I try to move in different social groups so that I can think differently. In classical Soviet educational models, particularly by Vygotsky, we talked about zones of proximal development. This was social learning, and it was dialogic, meaning that the social world we live in is already embedded in both our language and our understanding, and we think through not just ourselves, but each other. This fundamentally cuts against both rugged individualism and Enlightenment ways of thinking. We might hold the Enlightenment goal towards truth as a goal, but we don't think that way. Not inherently. And in some ways, the Enlightenment was an interesting and useful myth to try to train your brain towards truth, but this also fundamentally runs into a problem. And that's because you can take this towards truth shit to just reflect what you want to believe. And if you don't see that everywhere in your life, I don't know what to tell you. All right. Indeed, our rational capacities seem to have been developed largely in response to social pressures to mitigate practical issues related to living in collaborative groups, such as persuading others to do what we want or need them to do, avoiding getting manipulated by others in adverse ways. We don't have a problem with positive manipulation most of the time. Maintaining or enhancing the standing of ourselves in groups we identify with relative to others. This is also why alienation literally makes you dumber. Over time, the extraordinary capacities we developed to address these type of social conditions challenge developed into two distinct but interrelated cognitive systems. One system specializes in dealing with the immediate, routine, and necessary tasks and dilemmas. It works rapidly, automatically, and largely unconsciously, drawing on and producing tacit knowledge that we have but don't always articulate that we have. We might call this intuition. The other system is designed to deal with more difficult, novel, and high-stake challenges. It is more deliberative. It is a system of our conscious thought. Its outputs are more easily translated into words to be conveyed to others. We might call this the logical system, right? Or explicit logic. The latter cognitive system is what people are generally referring to when they talk about thinking or rationality. The former system is actually what drives most of our understanding of the world, drives most of our behaviors, and informs much of our conscious thought. As social psychologist John Haidt explained, I don't always love Haidt, but this isn't totally wrong. The mind is divided into parts, like a rider control processes on an elephant, automatic processes. The rider evolved to serve the elephant. Human minds, like animal minds, are constantly reacting intuitively to everything they perceive and basing their responses on those reactions. Within the first second of seeing, hearing, or meeting another person, the elephant has already begun to lean toward or away, and that lean influences what you think and do next. Intuitions come first. That's what I talk about training your intuition. It's about training your tacit knowledge. It's important. If you can't do that, a lot of your rationality is just useless. These general characteristics of human cognition shape everything people do, including knowledge and cultural production, and I would say especially knowledge and cultural production. On one hand, our socially evolved brains are capable of remarkable feats. Working and thinking together, we develop means of traveling into space. We split atoms. We can communicate instantaneously across continents. We can prevent people from contracting diseases like leprosy and polio that have long ravaged humankind. However, at an individual level, our ability to understand the world is inevitably constrained in some highly consequential ways. consider the process of perception. At all times, we are bombarded with stimuli. In the lecture hall, for instance, a professor could pay attention to how many students seem to be right-handed versus left-handed, how many ceiling or floor tiles there are in the room, what ratio of students are wearing corrective lenses, and so on ad infinitum. It is impossible to attend all the information that is available to us at any given time, and that's fine, because most of it isn't particularly valuable anyway. What we do pay attention to, and we can't remember every detail indefinitely, and it wouldn't avail us much if we could. Indeed, we make decisions about what to focus on and what to retain. This is called selection. We have to organize the details we observe into a relatively stable and coherent picture, often mistaking determination about how events and phenomena relate to one another. This is called organization. And then we have to make the inferences about what it all means, what the significance of observed phenomena are, and how we should respond to the things we observe. This is called interpretation. This process unfolds instantaneously and is largely unconscious, and for good reason. In the real world, we can't sit and ruminate indefinitely. Decisions must be made about what to focus on, what to remember, and how it all fits together, and if and why things matter, and if and how we should act, and so forth. We typically need to make these determinations quickly with limited information and dynamic conditions with a high degree of ambiguity and uncertainty. Trying to gather more and more information, contemplating things over and over without acting, this can have a high opportunity cost and lead to worse decisions in any event. Under most conditions, our intuitive cognitive systems are reliable, quick, and highly efficient. However, decisions we make about what to focus on are not, what we remember and how to remember it are don't, and how to interpret ambiguous signals. These choices are not made in random or disinterested ways. Our brains are not designed to produce an objective or true picture of the world. Instead, reflecting their social origins, which is why your social class matters so much, it literally is part of the way you think. Our cognitive capacities are oriented towards perceiving, interpreting, and describing reality in ways that enhance our fitness and further our goals, often generating a distorted understanding of the world around us in the process. We pay attention to, easily recall, and feel positive emotions towards things we deem interesting or useful. We dismiss, downplay, dump, or have negative emotional reactions to information that is threatening to our objectives or self-image, or that conflicts with our expectations or pre-existing beliefs. Maybe this is why leftists are so unhappy all the time, is because most things conflict with their pre-existing expectations. Things do not seem particularly significant in either direction. We largely ignore it, even though these neglected details often prove to be quite important in retrospect. These types of systemic distortions are known as biases. But still. They're tied to our core information problems we have to solve in light of our cognitive and perceptual limitations. And we need to act in order in the world despite them. We have the cognitive bias codex. I'm just going to describe this. This is a flower around a brain, and there's way too much information in this chart for me to convey, but it goes with what we need to remember, how we need to act fast, not meaning enough, and too much information. We have way too much information today, which is why it's less and less easy to pick out what information we need to focus on. Critically, it isn't just our perception that's biased. Our attributions, the causal stories we tell ourselves about why things are the way they are and why they happen the way they do and so on, operate in a similar way. When good things happen, we can possibly lay at our feet. We attribute those positive outcomes to stable and internal factors that are within our control, i.e. positive characteristics we possess and wise actions we took. This is survivor's bias, by the way. This is what it means. When bad things happen, we tell the opposite story. Adverse outcomes are always attributed to contingent and fleeting circumstances, things external to us and outside our control. We don't just tell these systemically skewed stories for ourselves, but also for groups, movements, and institutions we identify with. And for folks we disidentify with, the dynamics are reverse. We attribute good outcomes to luck, privilege, fleeting circumstances, and so on, and attribute bad outcomes to the durable characteristics and willful actions. This is why the happy consciousness is so useful, right? It is useful. This is why things like leftist best have always struck me as self-flattering and delusionary. Even if it was true, it's not helpful. Why is it not helpful? Because it confirms to our cognitive biases. We're saying our decisions are best, and that's why we believe in them. Well, everyone fucking thinks that. It's a given. That's why you believe shit. All right. In fact, most cognitive biases can be boiled down to a handful of self-serving assumptions like these. People typically think their beliefs are correct, morally, factual, or otherwise. I don't even know how you would say moral facts are correct, but whatever. We assume that we arrive at our beliefs in a good way, that we think for good reasons. We view our own experience as a good guide to how the world works. We perceive ourselves to be personally representative of the groups and institutions we identify with. Here's a table. I hate these kind of tables, but here's a table. Its sources over as Oberst and Imhoff 2023. Biases and fundamental beliefs on which they might be based. Our experiences is reasonable. And we have here the spotlight effect, the illusion of transparency, illusion of transparency of attention, false consensus, social projection. Oh my God, do I see all this stuff? Spotlight effect, overestimating the extent to which one is motivated, one is noticed by others, overestimating the extent in which one's own inner states are noticed by others, overestimating the extent to which an intention behind an ambiguous utterance that is clear to oneself is clear to others, overestimating the extent to which one's opinions, beliefs, etc. are shared, and a tendency to judge others as similar to oneself. I make the correct assessment of the world. Bias, blind spot, hostile, media bias, better than average effect, self-serving bias. My group is a reasonable reference. Ethnocentric bias in group projections. Yeah, my group is not a reasonable reference. Not you guys. Sorry. My group members is good. In-group bias, partisan bias, ultimate attribution error, linguistic in-group bias, in-group sensitivity effect. People's attributes, not context, shape, outcomes, fundamental attribution error, correspondence bias, outcome bias, or survival bias. I'm not going to go into the definition of all those. You can look them up. A corollary of these assumptions, which we encounter others who believe that are incompatible with our own, or who engage in behaviors that defy our expectations and sensibilities, we rarely start questioning our own views and by the means by which we arrived at them. Instead, we figure out what's wrong with those people who disagree with us. The first and typically dominant instinct is to explain deviances from our own views by appeals to deficits, ignorance, irrationality, lack of cognitive sophistication, inexperience, and pathologies. Those people are bigots, zealots, authoritarians, and so on. And if you don't see people doing this on all sides of the political spectrum, I don't know what you're looking at. But the question is, you don't just need to see other people doing it. You need to see how you do it. This is something on my mind a lot lately. How do I do these things? Not just how do other people do these things. How do I do them? And again, these aren't just tendencies that people have in their daily lives, but a symbolic capitalist somehow set aside when engaging with their work. The inclination towards tribalism, status seeking, and identity reinforcement, and other forms of motivated reasoning may be, in fact, the main purpose of our advanced cognitive faculties. It's the thing we're best at, and it influences everything we do. In principle, these well-documented and ubiquitous cognitive tendencies should inspire a sense of intellectual humility in symbolic capitalist, a deep awareness of our own fallibility and limits. I hope it does for me, but sometimes it doesn't. I'm also an asshole. In practice, however, people tend to think of themselves as exceptions to general rules. Most people view themselves as smarter, less biased, more authentic, and more moral than average, which obviously can't be true because we can't be all better than average. That's the Lake Wobegon effect. We tend to think that the forces that bind and blind everyone else do not govern our attitudes and behaviors to the same extent, if at all. other people, especially other people we don't identify with, are driven by self-interest, ideology, and so on. We're all driven by self-interest and ideology. We are motivated by strong ethical standards, including a principled commitment to the truth. Sociologist Andrew Abbott referred to this as knowledge alienation, declining to amplify information we have about the world to ourselves and institutions and groups we identify with. Indeed, even when people intellectually acknowledge that we are susceptible to bias and error, we're working from very limited knowledge and experiences, and other people might have important information that reveals our commitments to be erroneous. It's hard for us to actually feel that way. I definitely don't feel that way. I'm going to admit that, especially in moments of contestation. Yeah, I'm right. God damn it. This is because, with respect to many cognitive distortions, our brain is designed to avoid recognizing our bias. We have bias blind spots that interfere with our inability to recognize when our cognition is going astray. See another chart with bias blind spots from Pronin and Hazel, 2023. And I'm not going to go into all of it, but I'll do the inner circle. Biases with bias blind spots and self-promoting, belief-promoting, influence, validation, likelihood judgment, social judgment. So when people focus on the parasocial problem, sometimes you have to look at it, maybe it's a social problem. All right. Worse, even when we recognize that we may be engaging in motivated reasoning, the social motivations undergirding that reasoning may help us justify our biases to ourselves and to others. It should be emphasized again that with these cognitive tendencies are not necessarily pathological. No, they're not. Actually, they're not. These aren't mistakes in the way our brain's designed. I mean, they might be maladaptive in some instances, and I tried to train myself to cut against them, but we have them for a reason. In general, our biases and heuristics allow us to process and respond to extraordinary amounts of information quite quickly in dynamic circumstances. We could scarcely function without these distortions. Even in bracketing out the cognitive and perceptual limitations and constraints we have to work within, if we saw truly the world as it actually was, and if we saw ourselves and our loved ones as they actually are, if they saw us as we truly are, that would be unlikely to make us happy. Happy is for losers. All right, sorry. But I mean, I actually do sort of think when people are like, oh, I'm not happy. And I'm like, well, who the fuck told you were going to be happy? Likewise, if our actions are tightly calibrated to the statistical likelihood of success, there are many myths we wouldn't take and currently do take, and we miss out on a lot in life as a result. Most businesses fail within 6 years. An overwhelming majority of romantic relationships end in less than a year. I mean, most of the people you're attracted to and are attracted to you, you learn things about each other and you cut tail. Most employment relationships end up not working out for one or more parties eventually relative to the alternatives, typically leading to resignations or terminations within 5 years. Social movements rarely achieve their stated ends, if they even come close to it. Most innovations are maladaptive. The modal result of publication submission is rejection. Yep, I'll tell you that. An overwhelming majority of published scientific findings are wrong, trivial, and or non-impactful. If we allow these types of probabilities to govern our attitude and behaviors, we rarely invest ourselves in anything. And that's depressive realism. Not just capitalist realism, it's depressive realism. In reality, however, people do defy the odds all the time. Ostensibly irrational levels of confidence, conviction, resilience, and optimism often play important roles in these outcomes. Our biases and blind spots are therefore not a product of our cognitive limitations. They empower us to accomplish things that we otherwise may not. In Nietzschean terms, our cognitive distortions serve important life-enhancing functions. Sorry, Nietzsche. That said, it is also an empirical reality that biases and limitations to our perceptions, experience, and cognition often do cause practical problems. Ever lived with an artist? I do. I live with myself. And we're dicks. All right. Especially with respect to knowledge and cultural production, and particularly when it comes to contentious social topics. Our socially oriented cognition seeking status, tribal victories, and the like, often supervenes even sincere attempts to pursue truth whenever it leads. And I would actually add that egalitarian frameworks actually are more likely to lead to status seeking and more likely to have people push against it. After all, our natural impulses are to sort into groups with people who share our values, politics, and other identity commitments, and to publicly bring ourselves and push others into conformity with the group and try to suppress, exclude, or dominate others who are with incompatible goals or perspectives. This is why tribes exist. Although I will say that this wasn't always so abstract as it is today. Like, our natural impulses to do this were probably more helpful when we were actually fucking running from elephant herds or whatever. Our default inclination to perceive and interpret the world in ways that flatter our self-image, advance our interest, and reinforce our existing worldviews, while explaining others' deviance from our preferred positions through appeals to deficits and pathologies. It is not natural. In fact, it's often deeply unpleasant to slow down our judgments and think more carefully, taking care to avoid our biases, oversights, and errors. It is not natural to work amicably with people across lines of profound difference, making decisions about things like admission, hiring, and promotion primarily on the basis of merit. We often can't agree on what merit fucking is. That's me adding that. It is not natural, and in fact, it is very difficult, but also quite important, to recognize and publicly acknowledge our error. I try to do this a lot. I do not like it. It's never fucking fun. All right. And it's rarely rewarded. Because if you acknowledge an error, all the people who look up to you will also, particularly in our current situation, have to acknowledge their own errors, which is the last fucking thing they want to fucking do. All the swearing for emphasis is important. Then revise our attitudes, beliefs, and actions in according with the best available evidence, irrespective of our own expectations, interests, and preferences. Yep. Symbolic capitalists may be especially prone to bias and motivated reasoning because we're smart enough to convince ourselves of things in complicated ways. We build little ideological puzzle boxes for ourselves that are hard to actually get out of. And we do that for motivated reasons, and we're rewarded for it, by the way. Here, a discerning reader might object. While normies might be prone to cognitive distortions like the ones of Burb, symbolic capitalists are importantly different from other people. No, we're not. For instance, we have far more knowledge about various topics than the average person, and especially in respect to our areas of expertise. That's true. But this is the problem with relying on experts without any pushback, and this is a problem with the liberal view of expertise in general. Particularly when it's no longer concerned with competence, but with moral, or with like performative competence, but with moral competence, it can fool itself about goddamn near anything. We are cognitively sophisticated, i.e., we perform highly on assessments of intellectual ability. We are highly conscientious, allowing us to maintain high GPAs through our educational careers and ultimately to see our credentials through completion. Unless, of course, we're Nepo babies. We define ourselves in terms of our commitment to following the truth wherever it leads and acting in accordance with the best information. I actually do not define myself that way. I would love to believe that the truth was the only thing dominating what I do, and I know that that is not true. Surely these must influence our susceptibility to bias and motivated reasoning, right? Fortunately, we don't have to speculate on the matter. There's robust literature on the political psychology and cognition of people with high IQ scores, high GPAs, and high levels of education. You folks most likely to become symbolic capitalists. It turns out these kinds of people who take part in symbolic professions do tend to vary systemically from most other people, but not in the ways we like to think. For instance, most of us who work in symbolic professions assume that, although others may be driven primarily by prejudice, emotions, superstitions, dogma, and ignorance. I don't know how many college professors I know who believe in fucking astrology, so whatever. The position of people like us, highly educated, cognitively sophisticated, etc., are shaped by logic and the facts. No, I do not believe that. We make decisions based on careful consideration of the issue. We would readily change our minds if the facts were not on our side. or as relevant circumstances evolved. In reality, people who are highly educated, intelligent, or rhetorically skilled are significantly less likely than others to revise their beliefs or adjust their behaviors when confronted with evidence or arguments that contradict their preferred narratives or pre-existing beliefs. Precisely in virtue of knowing more about the world or being better at arguing, we are better equipped to punch holes in data or narratives that undermine our priors. All you have to do is listen to a liberal or well-educated conservative podcast to see how this works. We come up with excuses to stick to our guns irrespective of the facts, or to interpret threatening information in a way that flatters our existing worldview, and we typically do just that. This is a conflict of worldviews issue. Some of them can't be easily solved. They don't have the same teleology. In a decades-long set of ambitious experiments and forecasting tournaments, psychologist Philip Tedlock has demonstrated, as a result of their inclinations towards epistemic arrogance and ideological rigidity, I definitely understand. Experts are often worse than laymen in anticipating how events are likely to play out, especially with respect to their areas of expertise. This is why I talk so much about complexity and expertise. This is a problem. What's worse, cognitively sophisticated people tend not to be able to be very self-aware about our error rates either, and we excel at telling ourselves stories about how we are basically right when we were in fact clearly wrong, inhibiting our ability to learn from mistakes and miscalculations. In a similar vein, experts have been shown to perform a bit worse than laymen at predicting the likely effects of behavioral science interventions. Political practitioners have been found to be no better than lay people at predicting which political messages are persuasive. Duh. Look at what these fucking consultants and NGOs tell the Democrats to say. Comparative and longitudinals have found that highly educated political leaders perform no better than less educated ones, and may even be a bit worse in some respects. Unless they're smart enough to outsource to people who have different kinds of knowledge, I bet that's generally true, and they're less likely to do it. You don't want to delegate because you assume you do it well. Rather than becoming more likely to converge on the same position, people tend to grow more politically polarized on contentious topics such as knowledge, numeracy, reflectiveness. As their knowledge, numeracy, and reflectiveness increases, or when they try to think in an actively open-minded way. I don't ever try to think in an open-minded way. I have that benefit. All right, sorry. That's a cognitive bias on my part. These empirical patterns will be shocking and difficult to explain while operating under the assumption that humans' cognitive and perceptual systems are primarily oriented towards objective truth. However, these tendencies are exactly what one might expect if we instead work from the premise that our cognitive capacities are fundamentally geared towards group building and coalitional struggles, which is how we survive, by the way, and that we typically reason in ways that help us achieve our goals with and through other people, which is why alienation and social isolation is so goddamn bad. It literally makes you think shittier because the people around you help your brain. On this understanding of how the brain works, we might likewise expect that kinds of people are in the symbolic profession select for cognitively sophisticated, academically high-performing, highly educated, may be especially prone to tribalism, virtue signaling, and self-deception. And unfortunately, there's a lot of empirical evidence that seem to pull in that direction. For instance, highly educated Americans are also more likely than others to know what positions they should hold in virtue of their partisan and ideological identities, and are much more likely to align their beliefs to systemically accord with those identities. So you are changing your beliefs all the time, but without a way that you're noticing it, it's tacit. We are more likely to form opinions on issues we don't previously have strong opinions about by looking to partisan cues and modifying our existing positions to bring them into line with the new messaging from party leaders. And man, do we enforce this on the left. We really do. On issues that have no fucking bearing on the cores of our political identity and ethical virtues. Politically sophisticated Americans are more likely to systemically accord their political beliefs and preferences to their religion, race, gender, or sexuality, conforming with what they should think or say on a basis of their identity characteristics, while other in-group peers tend to have a much more heterogeneous sets of views and dispositions, and we often mock them as incoherent. But our own views are often incoherent. They're just coherent to our social grouping, but incoherent to like logic. That is, in a literal sense, the kinds of people who comprise the symbolic professions try to be politically correct in their views much more than other Americans. It should therefore not be surprising that college-educated Americans are more likely than other Americans to self-censor. Nor should it be shocking to discover that censorship in science is heavily driven by scientists themselves, typically against people whose moral and political view diverge from the scientists' own. With respect to political engagement, highly educated voters are much more likely than others to donate to political causes. I've only done that once. They're also more likely to have flexible work schedules that facilitate higher rates of voting, protesting, and other political activities. Hence the student cadre problem. Yet, although these constituents tend to be more politically engaged on average, their political involvement is also much less likely to be oriented towards pragmatic ends. So, not actually trying to achieve anything. Indeed, Americans with high levels of education gravitate towards political hobbyism and expressive voting. That is, engaging in political research, discourse, and other activities for the purpose of self-aggrandizement, entertainment, validation of one's own identity, and so forth, instead of trying to realize concrete and practical goals. This is why I tell you so much of what we're doing here is not politics, right? Because a lot of what I'm doing is validating you, whether you realize it or not. And I can get captured by you in that validation, and we see how destructive it is. But one of the things we'll see today is that a lot of people just are really, really tied up in their political identities so much they can't really deal with the situation, and they always project this elsewhere. And I'm going to deal with some articles that do that. In virtue of these tendencies, highly educated people tend to follow political horse races much more closely than the general public. I know I do, even though I also think they're bullshit simultaneously. And often are much better versed in contemporary political gossip, drama, and scandals. Guilty as charged. We also tend to be a little bit more informed than most people with respect to more substantive facts, often lacking rudimentary knowledge about core civic institutions and processes. Yet we tend to be little more informed than most people in respect to more substantive facts, often like an even rudimentary knowledge about core civic institutions and processes. I have tried to fix this because I used to teach government. For those of you who don't know, I used to teach government. And so I am very aware of this and know that it's lacking because the ideological blather that I hear from a lot of people, particularly in the arts section, but also in, activist world, indicates people do not understand basic things about the government, the Constitution, etc. And often me just saying stuff like, you can't abolish the Senate unless you control 2/3 of the states, and good fucking luck with that when you're concentrated in coastal areas that are high population density but also high wealth. You really don't have a way to appeal to majority of people. And even when you hang out with working class people, you're not dealing with the fact that those working class people exist in this larger institution that has ties to these, different ideological capture things. Yeah. You're not going to look at, how the Constitution actually works. And I'm not ideologically attached to the Constitution all that much. A lot of the people I know who are really into the Constitution, even on the left, don't know that much about it. And they don't know much about the history of institutional development either. And the only reason I am so aware of this, and it doesn't always help, I'm going to say this, just knowing this doesn't always help, is because I used to see myself do the same shit. The more we think we know, the less self-aware we tend to become in respect to our biases and ignorance. As social psychologist Ken Stanovich put it, if you are a person of high intelligence, if you are highly educated and you are strongly committed to an ideological viewpoint, you will be highly likely to think that you have your thought, you weigh to your viewpoint. I don't. I will say that I don't actually think I've thought my way to my viewpoint. I think I experience my way to my viewpoint. And even that's questionable. Certain moral values have not changed at all, and others have dramatically. Anyway, and you will be even less likely than the average person to realize that you derived your beliefs from social groups you belong to, and because they fit with your temperament and your innate psychological propensities. Well, maybe my temperament is just so irascible it's not really a problem. But I do know I derived a lot of my beliefs from the groups I belong to, which is why I go out and try to exist with different groups. And also because I live in even though I live in Gomorrah, a very blue area in a very red state, I tend to realize these things. And I also realize things like when I changed my education level in my first marriage, for example, it made my first marriage much harder. Even though my first wife was brilliant, but she was not highly educated. All right. Indeed, education and cognitive sophistication themselves seem to increasingly serve as a key bias for tribalism. I think when you add in complexity theory into this, and this is one thing I wish Musa or Gharbi would do, you start seeing how this becomes even more complicated. Because with complexity theory, one of your limitations is your own specialization not only limits you, but also just limits your ability to listen to other people. And eventually limits your ability to communicate with them to even get feedback. High educated people tend to marry and socialize with others possessing similar levels of education as themselves. And that's gotten more true, not less. Even among the highly educated, those with high levels of academic performance tend to cluster together and gradually abandoning social ties with those with lower GPAs. I definitely saw that in my life. Like, seriously, I was brought up and I was tracked low cross back when we still did tracking, and worked my way up into the honors and college preparatory classes and AP classes and stuff like that. And it completely changed who I associated with for a long time. And a lot of people who I used to interact with as a child would, particularly when I didn't think about code switching later on, would often find me haughty and arrogant and general asshole and hard to listen to. And they were right, you know. And by the way, I mean, those things are still true. But I know them. I know them about myself. And with respect to engaging with others, college graduates look down on those with fewer or worse credentials than themselves. I used to, until I started meeting people with credentials like myself and realizing what it said about me was not very good. All right. One series of studies looking at college grads in the United States and Western European countries found that people who graduated from college viewed less educated people more unfavorably than they did any other reference group. That's why you hear so much about education. They were also less supportive of programs to help the less educated compared to other potential recipients. Cough, cough. You wonder why this neoliberalism stuff is still there. It's just as cutthroat and meritocratic as the shit you hear from the right sometimes, but it's clothed in better clothing. And while they often express some sense of shame or regret for the prejudice against other groups, they are unbiased in the prejudice against those less educated than themselves. And in light of the ways educational attainment varies systemically along lines of race, gender, and class, these forms of education-based prejudice often exacerbate and reinforce other forms of bias and discrimination. I definitely see that. Likewise, although highly educated and cognitively sophisticated Americans are less likely to express racial prejudice views on surveys, we tend to be far more prejudicial than most against those who have ideological views that diverge from our own, despite the reality that the kinds of ideologies symbolic capitalists are drawn to are robustly associated with increased risk of neuroticism, anxiety, and depression. Highly intelligent people are also much more prone to overreact to small shocks, challenges, or slights. Oh my God, watch liberal Bluesky whenever Trump opens his mouth. Now, I also will notice I am guilty of aspiring in those dark places. It's a place that I go all the time. But I know that about me. That is, we are more sensitive and tolerant of many forms of conflict or disagreement. I like conflict. But yeah, I see this all the time. I mean, it's all the people who think they have a real educated worldview that's open-minded and all this, who are often blocking everybody on fucking Twitter. Even the apparent racial and ethnic tolerance that the highly educated voters exhibit may be a function of the fact that, precisely in virtue of being more elite than other Americans, symbolic capitalist material interests, ambitions, and life prospects do not appear threatened by people from historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups. Research has found that when highly educated people do come to sense their own interests or prospects are undermined or threatened by competition with racial ethnic minorities, they often become statistically more hostile towards groups in question despite their previous egalitarian leanings. And I can't tell you how many white nationalist leaders I met who are former fucking professors. There's not many around anymore, but there's definitely a time. The humanities professor turned right nationalist is a thing. That's also why some of the most virulent people on the right are highly educated. And I know we don't notice that they're so different from their base, but it's usually because they met real hostility and they had a real threat, and then all of a sudden they justified it real hard. I see a lot. More generally, although cognitively sophisticated people are more likely than most to endorse racial equality in principle, they seem to be no more likely than others to support policies that would undermine relative advantages they personally enjoy. Cough, 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 cough. Even the YIMBY people are YIMBY, but only to a point. And their cognitive sophistication is part of what may allow them to justify this gap to themselves and others. High levels of creativity have likewise been found to be connected with higher levels of unethical behavior, partly because highly creative individuals excel at rationalizing harmful actions to others and themselves and tend to think of themselves as exceptions to the rules that others play by. And part of it, as a consequence of our ability to produce rationalizations of this nature, highly educated Americans tend to be less aware of our own social political preferences than most. Typically describing ourselves as more left-wing than we actually seem to be. Studies consistently find that highly educated and cognitively sophisticated voters tend to gravitate towards a marriage of cultural liberalism and economic conservatism. It's not just libertarians, people. However, we regularly understand ourselves to be down-the-line leftists. As economist James Rocky put it, how does education affect ideology? It would seem that the better educated, if anything, are less accurate in how they perceive their ideology. I mean, all you have to do is look at California voting patterns to see this. Higher levels of education are associated with being less likely to believe one to be right-wing, while simultaneously being associated with being in favor of increased inequality. Like, more education. I'm not saying that we couldn't have a much more educated world that was equal. And I don't want to sound like I'm not. But this is something you have to check yourself with. In addition to our poor self-awareness with respect to how committed to egalitarianism we actually are, highly educated Americans tend to be much worse at gauging other people too, typically assuming others are more extreme or dogmatic than they actually seem to be. Oh yeah, I definitely see that. Calling everybody a fascist thing. This is perhaps a kind of product of the reality that, as compared with the general public, the kinds of people who become academics, highly educated, cognitively sophisticated, academically high performing, tend to themselves be more ideological in their thinking, more dogmatic in their views, more extreme in their ideological leanings than everybody else. Well, I know that about myself. And the process of attaining a college education seems to drive people further in the direction of moral absolutism. No, yeah, I'm not a moral absolutist. A recent National Bureau of Economic Research study found that the Americans most prone to zero-sum thinking included people who lived in cities, those who have especially low or high levels of income. I've talked about this before, how the bottom and the top often resemble each other more than they realize. People who identify as strong Democrats and people who possess a postgraduate degree. Critically, even though symbolic capitalists tend to hold moral and political views that are out of step with most other Americans, they tend to operate under the false notion that we do, in fact, represent the real and interest of the will and interest of the public. I don't. I do not believe that I represent the public at all. So that whole special snowflake bias that we have definitely applies to me, but the whole the world thinks like me definitely does not. I do not assume most people think like me, and it's not because I'm special; it's because I'm weird. I mean, that's just a different way of framing the same thing, but still. And when we're confronted with evidence that the people seem to be in disagreement with us, we often assert that this is not because we misunderstood other people's interests, but whether the others don't stand their own interests correctly. I fucking hate this. I hate when people do this. This is my issue with false consciousness claims and always has been. That they've been indoctrinated, misinformed, or otherwise operating under false consciousness. No, they're just operating on an immediate time scale most of the time. And sometimes their immediate time scale is in their right direction. And then people, when they respond to that, just get more and more dogmatic and talk about how, like, I mean, I've literally seen leftists talk about how we need to, like, help the people to how we need to kill them all. Not joking. I've seen it a lot. In reality, there's very little evidence that indoctrination is a thing, or if it is a thing, we do it to ourselves. And that misinformation seems to be the rule rather than the exception in human affairs, including and especially among symbolic capitalists. As Orwell put it, many of our ideas are so patently ridiculous that only an intellectual will give them the time of day. One of the things I do like about Orwell, whose ideas were often so patently ridiculous and only an intellectual will give them a time of day himself, but still. Often, and again, we should adopt outlandish ideas in large part to signal our group membership, our moral and intellectual virtues, and we properly abandon many positions when they seem inadequate or counterproductive to those purposes. True values be damned. Did I mention that the post-2010 Great Awakening is rapidly winding down? In short, far from being independent thinkers who came to their position on issues through careful deliberation of the facts, who change their minds readily in accordance with the facts, and who make wise decisions referring to the facts, the kinds of people we are likely to become symbolic capitalists, highly educated, academically high-performing, cognitively sophisticated, are more likely than most to be dogmatic ideologues or partisan conformists. I mean, particularly in school. School breeds conformity. But a lot of ways out of school just make you a goober. So I don't... Like, there's got to be a balance there. Yet it's difficult for us to recognize that these tendencies in ourselves due to our biased blind spots and increased capabilities for motivated reasoning. Put it another way, it's precisely because the symbolic professions contain highly concentrations of smart and knowledgeable people that they are riven with bias, motivated reasoning, groupthink, and ideological parochialism. Subject matter expertise and cognitive sophistication doesn't empower folks to overcome the general human tendency towards bias and motivated reasoning. And in fact, if anything, it makes it worse. Oh, they said it. If anything, they can make it harder. And institutions, symbolic capitalists are embedded and often exacerbate these tendencies even further. And that's what gets me. It's not that we have these tendencies. I mean, everybody does. The smarter you are, you better you are at it. But it's that we also build institutions and have been building institutions that protect us from the correction of the public. And I see this a lot in liberals who like, we need professional politicians, but we believe in democracy. Well, if you need professional politicians and you believe in democracy, what you're really saying is that the average person can't correct you because of their general bias. Which is it? And a lot of people right now, whether you're a far leftist or a liberal, whatever, and even if you think a lot of what's going on politically is shenanigans and farcical, and I do, you got to ask yourself, what did you do to contribute to this? What biases did you have? And what have you been not able to look at? You, me, not everyone else. The mote in your eye first. Because naturally, we're going to come up with a cognitive way to avoid it. Protect your peace within limits. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, and take care.